The airport thrummed with life, a steady pulse of motion and noise. Passengers moved in waves, their chatter blending with the hum of luggage wheels and the clipped voices of flight announcements. Sarah Collins walked through it all with measured steps, her eyes scanning the bustling terminal while her hand rested lightly on Max's leash. The Belgian Malinois matched her pace, his nose hovering close to the polished floor, his movements sharp and purposeful. Max slowed as they neared the baggage claim area, his ears twitching. Sarah tightened her grip on the leash, a flicker of anticipation tightening her chest. She had worked with Max long enough to know that his sudden change in demeanor wasn't random. "What is it, boy?" she asked under her breath. Max's pace quickened, leading her toward the far side of the terminal, where a row of vents lined the walls near the floor. As they approached, Max froze, then lunged toward one of the vents, his paws scratching furiously at the metal. Sarah crouched beside him, brushing her hand over his sleek coat to calm him. "Okay, Max, let's see what's going on." She glanced around, spotting a maintenance worker adjusting a nearby panel. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice firm but polite. "Can you open this vent?" The man hesitated, his brow furrowing as he looked at her and then at Max, whose focus hadn't wavered. "Is something wrong?" "My dog's trained to detect threats," she replied. "He's picked something up here. I need this opened." The worker nodded and retrieved a screwdriver from his belt, quickly kneeling to loosen the screws. Sarah stayed close, her pulse quickening with each turn of the tool. Max's intensity told her that whatever was inside wasn't trivial. The vent cover came off with a faint metallic groan, and Sarah leaned closer, peering into the darkness. Her eyes narrowed as she spotted something tucked just out of reach, a small package wrapped in plastic. "Step back," she ordered, pulling on a pair of gloves. Her voice was calm, but inside adrenaline surged. Carefully, she retrieved the object, feeling its weight in her hand. She peeled back a corner of the plastic, revealing the unmistakable glint of circuitry and wiring. The maintenance worker's eyes widened. "Is that?" Sarah straightened, her jaw tightening. "Call airport security. Now." Hours later, Sarah sat in the dimly lit operations room, reviewing footage from the security cameras near the baggage claim. The airport had been partially evacuated while the bomb squad secured the area, confirming that the device was non-functional but expertly constructed. They hadn't found any others yet, but Sarah's gut told her this wasn't over. Her eyes flicked across the screen, watching the loop of passengers moving through the terminal. Max sat by her feet, his head resting on his paws, his presence grounding her. She scrubbed back through the footage, slowing it to half speed. And then she saw him. A man in a baseball cap, his face mostly obscured, stepped into view. His posture was slightly hunched, his movements deliberate as he approached the vent and crouched down. He pulled something from his bag, his hands moving deftly before he stood and walked away. Sarah froze the frame, leaning closer to the monitor. It couldn't be. The slope of his shoulders, the faint scar on his forearm just visible where his sleeve rode up. She knew him. Her breath caught as her mind raced to make sense of what she was seeing. It was Ethan, her brother. For a moment, the room seemed to spin. Memories flooded back, Ethan's laugh, his protective nature, the way he always stood up for her when they were kids. She hadn't seen him in years, not since he left town after being discharged from the military. The boy she'd idolized growing up couldn't be the same man she was seeing on the screen. Max stirred, nudging her leg as if sensing her turmoil. She looked down at him, her chest tightening. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the frozen image on the monitor. She didn't have time to process the why or how, not now. The only thing she knew for certain was that she had to find Ethan before anyone else did. The night air outside the airport was thick with humidity, clinging to Sarah as she leaned against her squad car, the events of the day looping in her mind. The bomb squad was still combing through the terminal, and Max was resting in the back seat, his ears twitching occasionally in response to distant noises. "Ethan." She stared at the frozen image on her phone, a screenshot of the security footage she couldn't bring herself to share with anyone yet. Her brother, planting what could have been a deadly device. The boy who once taught her how to ride a bike, who used to sneak cookies to her before dinner, now involved in something so dangerous it made her stomach churn. Her radio crackled. "Collins, report back inside. We've got a lead." Sarah exhaled deeply, straightened her uniform, and opened the door to let Max out. He jumped to the ground gracefully, his tail wagging faintly as if to reassure her. "Come on, buddy," she murmured, gripping his leash. "Time to work." Inside, the operations room buzzed with activity. Officers shuffled between monitors, reports, and maps of the airport. Sarah's commanding officer approached, his expression grim. "We found traces of a second device in Terminal C," he said. "Same type as the first, non-functional, but it looks like part of a larger system. Any luck with the footage?" Sarah hesitated. She felt the weight of the truth pressing against her chest, but couldn't bring herself to speak it yet. "Still reviewing it," she lied. "There's a lot to go through." Her CO nodded. "Keep at it. We're running out of time." Max led Sarah through Terminal C, his nose twitching as they passed through crowds of tired travelers. She kept her eyes on him, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. But her thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan. She remembered their last conversation almost 4 years ago. Ethan had been discharged from the military and seemed different, distant. They'd met for coffee, and he barely touched his cup, his fingers drumming against the table as he spoke in clipped sentences about feeling abandoned by the system he'd once served. "I gave them everything," he had said, his voice low and tight, "and they just threw me away." She'd tried to reach out after that, calling, texting, even visiting his old apartment, but he had disappeared. And now, here he was, back in her life, in the worst possible way. Max's sudden bark jolted her back to the present. He pulled toward a row of lockers near the edge of the terminal, his body tense. Sarah's pulse quickened as she signaled for backup, her hand hovering near her radio. When the other officers arrived, they carefully opened the locker Max had singled out. Inside, they found another device, identical to the first. Sarah felt a pang of relief that it wasn't active, but the questions only grew louder in her mind. Who was Ethan working with? What was their end game? Back at the operations room, Sarah finally sat alone, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She stared at Ethan's face on the screen, willing herself to see a sign, a reason, anything that could explain his involvement. A knock on the door startled her. It was another officer holding out a folder. "We found something else," he said. Sarah opened the folder, her heart sinking as she flipped through its contents. Flight schedules, security schematics, and handwritten notes in a familiar scrawl. Ethan's handwriting. She clenched the folder tightly, her chest tightening. She had to confront him, but how? The brother she remembered wouldn't have done this. There had to be a reason, a desperate one. Max nudged her leg again, grounding her in the moment. She knelt down, scratching behind his ears. "It's you and me, Max," she whispered. "We'll figure this out." But even as she said it, a flicker of doubt crept into her voice. Could she stop Ethan without breaking what little remained of her family? The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of floorboards as Sarah paced. She hadn't been here in years. Ethan's old place, the one he'd kept even after their parents passed away. The air smelled faintly of dust and memories, and every corner seemed to hold a piece of their childhood. Max sat by the door, his amber eyes following Sarah as she moved. He could sense her unease, the way her hands clenched and unclenched as she picked up and put down a framed photo of her and Ethan at a 4th of July barbecue years ago. She couldn't stop thinking about him, about how they used to be inseparable. He had been her protector, her hero, the one who stepped up when their parents were gone. She remembered the nights he would sit by her bed, reading her favorite book, just to keep the nightmares away. But those memories felt distant now, blurred by time and by what he had become. She sat on the worn couch and closed her eyes, letting the memories flood back. They were kids again, running through the woods behind their house. Ethan, 3 years older and infinitely braver, led the way, his laughter echoing in the trees. Sarah struggled to keep up, her smaller legs tripping over roots and rocks. "Come on, slowpoke," Ethan called, his grin wide and infectious. "You can do it!" When she fell and scraped her knee, he was there in an instant, pulling her up and brushing the dirt off her hands. "You're tough, right?" he said, his tone serious. She nodded, swallowing her tears. "Then prove it," he said, offering his hand. Sarah smiled as she took it, his strength pulling her back to her feet. Her eyes opened, the weight of the present crushing her chest. That Ethan was gone, or maybe he wasn't. Maybe he was still somewhere beneath the anger and bitterness she had seen growing in him over the years. She stood, her gaze falling on a stack of papers on the table, flight schedules, more of his handwritten notes. And then something caught her eye, a photograph, partially hidden beneath the pile. It was a picture of the two of them, taken years ago at her police academy graduation. She remembered how proud he had been, even if he didn't say it outright. He had shown up late in his military uniform, but he had been there. That had meant everything. Max whined softly, pulling her back to the moment. She knelt beside him, running her hand over his head. Then her gaze drifted, as if looking past the room and into the audience.
If you've been through it or you're going through it, write it down. Tell me. I want to understand. Because all I feel right now is confusion, fear, and still, I hope. I hope he can come back to me. I hope I can get my brother back. You ever had someone close to you that seemed out of themselves? Someone you love who suddenly felt like a stranger? Maybe not as extreme as this. Maybe just bad decisions or words that shouldn't have been said but were. Do you still believe they can come back? Do you still want to help them?
Her voice trailed off and she blinked, grounding herself again in the room. Max whined softly again, and she knelt to scratch behind his ears. A sound outside made her freeze. She moved to the window, peering through the blinds. It was Ethan's truck, unmistakable even in the dim streetlight. Her heart pounded as she stepped back, unsure of what to do. The front door creaked open, and there he was, standing in the doorway. He looked older, tired, but his presence filled the room like a storm cloud. "Sarah," he said, his voice low. "Ethan." Her throat felt dry, her voice barely audible. He stepped inside, his eyes darting to Max, then back to her. "I figured you'd come here. You always knew where to find me." "Why, Ethan?" she asked, cutting straight to the point. "Why are you doing this?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You wouldn't understand." "Then make me understand," she said, her voice rising. "You owe me that much." Ethan hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Do you have any idea what it's like to give everything to a country that doesn't care about you? To come home and feel invisible? To watch everything you worked for mean nothing?" "I don't," she admitted. "But this, planting bombs, scaring innocent people, that's not who you are. Who I am doesn't matter anymore," he snapped. "This is bigger than me, bigger than you." Max growled softly, sensing the tension, but Sarah placed a calming hand on his back. "It does matter," she said, her tone softening. "You matter. To me." For a moment, Ethan's hardened expression faltered, but just as quickly he shook his head, retreating toward the door. "You should leave," he said. "This is the last warning you'll get." Before she could stop him, he was gone. Sarah sank onto the couch, her mind racing. She didn't know how, but she would stop him, for his sake and for everyone else. Max pressed his head against her knee, grounding her once again. "We'll stop him," she whispered, stroking his fur. "Together." Sarah sat in her car, staring blankly at the dashboard. Ethan's words echoed in her mind, each one heavier than the last. She had seen the anger in his eyes, but beneath it, she'd caught something else. Doubt. It was fleeting, but it was there, like a crack in the armor he'd built around himself. Max shifted in the passenger seat, his ears twitching as he watched her. She sighed and reached over to scratch behind them. "We're running out of time, Max," she muttered. Her radio crackled to life, snapping her out of her thoughts. "Collins, update on the sweep. Are you available to assist in Terminal D?" She grabbed the receiver, her voice steady. "Copy that. I'll head over." La Terminal D was a sea of organized chaos. TSA agents redirected passengers, bomb technicians examined suspicious items, and police officers worked to keep the area secure. Sarah scanned the scene, her focus razor-sharp, but her thoughts remained tethered to Ethan. Max tugged at his leash, his nose catching something. Sarah followed him as he led her toward a service corridor, his body tense with focus. She nodded to the officer guarding the entrance, showing her badge as they passed. The corridor was quiet, the hum of machinery the only sound. Max stopped abruptly, his ears perking up. Sarah crouched beside him, scanning the area. Her flashlight caught something tucked behind a stack of crates, a black duffel bag. "Good boy," she whispered, her pulse quickening. She radioed for backup, keeping her voice low. Possible device located in Terminal D service corridor, requesting bomb squad. As she waited, her phone buzzed. She hesitated before pulling it out, her heart sinking when she saw the message. "You shouldn't be here, Sarah." Her grip tightened on the phone. Ethan was watching. She looked around, her eyes narrowing. He was close, too close. The bomb squad arrived moments later, quickly securing the area. Sarah stepped aside, watching as they worked, her mind racing. Ethan's message wasn't just a warning, it was personal. He wasn't trying to hurt her, he was trying to push her away. Later that night, Sarah sat alone in her office, Max curled up at her feet. The room was silent except for the occasional rustle as she flipped through files. Every detail pointed to one thing: Ethan wasn't working alone. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. She stared at the screen, her breath catching when she saw the blocked number. She answered, her voice cautious. "Hello?" "Sarah." Ethan's voice was quieter now, almost soft. "Ethan," she said, her grip on the phone tightening. "You need to stop this. Whatever you think you're doing, it's not too late to walk away." "It's already too late," he replied. "You don't understand. They'll come for me if I don't finish this." "Who?" she pressed. "Who's making you do this?" There was a long pause. She could hear his breathing, the hesitation in it. "They promised me a way out," he said finally, "a way to matter again. I didn't think it would go this far." "Ethan, listen to me," she said, her voice trembling. "You matter. You always mattered. You don't need to prove anything to anyone." Another pause. "I can't stop it, Sarah. It's too big." "Then let me help you," she pleaded. "Tell me where you are." The line went dead. Sarah lowered the phone, her mind racing. Ethan was trapped, not just by whoever had drawn him into this, but by his own guilt and anger. She couldn't wait for him to come around. She had to find him before it was too late. Max stirred, lifting his head as if sensing her resolve. She knelt beside him, gripping his collar. "We're close, Max," she said, her voice steady. "We'll find him. We have to." With one last look at the files spread across her desk, she grabbed her jacket and headed for the door. The clock was ticking, and she wasn't about to lose her brother again. The warehouse loomed ahead, its shadow cutting through the faint glow of the streetlights. Sarah parked a few blocks away, her grip on the steering wheel tight as she ran through the plan in her head. Ethan's phone pinged near this location, and while she wasn't sure what she'd find inside, she knew one thing: she had to confront him. Max sat upright in the passenger seat, his ears perked, ready for action. Sarah reached over and gave him a firm pat on the side. "This is it, Max. Let's bring him home." The approach was quiet, her boots barely making a sound on the cracked asphalt. Max walked beside her, his movements fluid, his nose twitching as he scanned the air. The building's side entrance was slightly ajar, a faint sliver of light spilling out onto the pavement. Sarah pushed the door open cautiously, her hand resting on her holstered weapon. The space inside was cavernous, rows of crates stacked haphazardly against the walls. A faint mechanical hum filled the air, broken occasionally by the distant sound of footsteps. Max stiffened, his ears swiveling. Sarah followed his lead, her heart pounding as they moved deeper into the building. Then she saw him. Ethan stood near the far end of the room, his back to her as he worked over a large device spread across a table. Tools and wires were scattered around him, his movements precise but frantic. "Ethan!" Sarah called, her voice echoing in the empty space. He froze, his shoulders tensing. Slowly he turned to face her. His expression was a mix of guilt and defiance, his eyes darting to Max, then back to her. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low. "I had to come," she replied, stepping closer. Max stayed by her side, his body taut but calm. "This has to stop, Ethan. It's not that simple," he snapped, running a hand through his hair. "Do you have any idea what they'll do to me if I don't finish this?" "Who are they?" she pressed, her voice steady but firm. "Who pulled you into this?" Ethan hesitated, his gaze flickering. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that I can't stop now. If I do, they'll come after me, and you." "Ethan, you don't have to do this alone," she said, taking another step closer. "We can fix this together, but you have to let me help you." "Help me?" He laughed bitterly, gesturing to the mess of wires and components on the table. "You think you can fix this? It's too late, Sarah. It's all too late." "It's never too late," she said softly. "Not for you, not for us." Max barked suddenly, his nose pointing toward a nearby door. Sarah turned her head just in time to see two figures stepping into the room, their faces obscured by masks. Ethan tensed, his hands clenching into fists. "They're here," he muttered. The two men approached, their voices low and threatening. "We told you not to involve anyone else," one of them growled, pointing at Sarah. "She's not part of this," Ethan said, stepping between them. "Doesn't matter now," the second man replied, pulling a gun. "She's seen too much." Before Sarah could react, Max lunged. His powerful body collided with the man, knocking him to the ground as the gun clattered across the floor. The other man scrambled to grab it, but Sarah was faster. She kicked the weapon away and drew her own, her voice sharp. "Hands where I can see them!" The man hesitated, glancing at his partner, who was pinned beneath Max. Finally, he raised his hands, his face pale. Minutes later, backup arrived. The two men cuffed and escorted out of the warehouse. Sarah turned to Ethan, who stood motionless, his face pale as he watched everything unfold. "You could have been killed," he said quietly, his voice shaking. "So could you," she replied. He shook his head, his expression crumbling. "I didn't want this, Sarah. I just wanted to matter again." She stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "You matter to me. You always have." For a moment, Ethan looked like the brother she remembered, the boy who had always been there for her, no matter what. He nodded, his shoulders sagging as the fight drained out of him. "Let's go home," she said. Max trotted beside them as they left the warehouse, his tail wagging slightly. Sarah glanced down at him, her chest tightening with gratitude. He had saved them both in more ways than one. Ethan looked at Max and then at Sarah, his voice quiet. "You've got a good partner." "I do," she replied, "and so do you. You just forgot for a while." As they stepped out into the night, Sarah felt the weight on her shoulders lighten. It wasn't the end of the road, but it was a start. Ethan was still her brother, and she wasn't going to let him slip away again. The drive to the rehabilitation center was quiet, save for the faint hum of the car engine. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tightly, glancing at Ethan through the corner of her eye. He sat with his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed out the window. His face was calm, but Sarah could see the storm brewing beneath the surface. The doubt, the fear, the weight of everything that had happened. Max lay in the back seat, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed, but alert as always. Ethan finally broke the silence. "You think they'll actually listen to me?" he asked, his voice low. Sarah tightened her grip. "If you tell them everything you've told me, they will, and I'll make sure they do." He nodded, but didn't look convinced. "I don't even know where to start." Sarah glanced at him as the light turned red. "You start with the truth, Ethan, about who pulled you into this, what they promised you, and why you went along with it. They'll see that you're taking responsibility, that you're not just some monster." Ethan flinched at the word, and Sarah regretted saying it, but she let it hang in the air. He needed to face it. They both did. The rehabilitation center was tucked away in a quiet part of the city, surrounded by tall trees and open fields. It was far from the sterile, cold institutions Ethan had imagined. The brick building looked almost welcoming, with large windows and a garden out front. Sarah parked and turned off the engine, but neither of them moved right away. "You sure about this?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah turned to face him, her expression soft but firm. "This isn't just about you, Ethan. It's about everyone who's been hurt because of what you were part of. It's about making things right. And yeah, I'm sure." Ethan sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. "I don't know if I can make it right." "You can start," Sarah said. "And starting is enough." Inside, they were greeted by a counselor, a kind-faced woman named Dr. Bennett. She introduced herself with a warm smile and led them to a small private room. The walls were painted a calming shade of blue, and there was a pot of fresh flowers on the table. Ethan sat down reluctantly, his shoulders hunched, while Sarah sat beside him, Max lying at her feet. Dr. Bennett opened a file and looked at Ethan. "First, I want to thank you for being here. This is a big step and it's not an easy one." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, well, I didn't really have a choice." Sarah touched his arm lightly. "You do have a choice, Ethan. You made the choice to be here. That matters." Dr. Bennett smiled. "Your sister's right. This is your choice, and it's the first of many steps toward healing, for yourself and for those affected by your actions. But let's start simple. Why don't you tell me a little about what brought you here?" Ethan looked at Sarah, then at Max, who lifted his head slightly as if encouraging him. Ethan took a deep breath, his voice trembling as he began to speak. As Ethan talked, Sarah leaned back in her chair, listening closely. He spoke about the men who had recruited him, how they'd found him when he was at his lowest, how they'd promised him purpose, belonging, and a way to feel important again. He described the guilt that had gnawed at him with every step he took down that path, and how he had convinced himself it was all justified, until it wasn't. "I wanted to matter," he said, his voice breaking, "and I thought this was the only way to do it, but I just made everything worse." Dr. Bennett nodded, jotting notes as she spoke gently. "Acknowledging that is the first step. It shows you're ready to make amends. And making amends starts with understanding the harm caused, not just to others, but to yourself." Ethan's eyes flickered to Sarah. "I didn't just hurt strangers. I hurt her. I hurt my sister." Sarah felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, but she kept her voice steady. "And I'm still here, Ethan. I'm not going anywhere." Over the next several hours, Ethan went through intake and orientation, meeting others who were also there to rebuild their lives. Sarah stayed as long as she could, but eventually the time came for her to leave. They stood together in the parking lot, the sun casting long shadows across the ground. "I don't know how to thank you," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion, "for not giving up on me." Sarah smiled, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "You always told me not to give up, remember? When I was little and scared of everything. You were the one who said I could do anything. I'm just giving that back to you." Ethan nodded, his throat working as he tried to find the right words. In the end, he just said, "I'll try." "That's all I need to hear," Sarah said, "one step at a time." He bent down and gave Max a long, grateful pat. "Take care of her, buddy." Max wagged his tail, letting out a soft huff, as if to say, "Always." On the drive back, the silence felt different, lighter. Sarah glanced at Max, who was stretched out in the passenger seat, his ears relaxed. She smiled, reaching over to scratch behind them. "We did it, Max," she said softly. "We brought him back." As the city lights came into view, she allowed herself to hope. For Ethan, for herself, for the future. Life wouldn't be perfect, but they'd taken the first step, and for now, that was enough. Max let out a contented sigh, and Sarah couldn't help but laugh. Okay. You deserve a big steak for this one." Together, they drove into the dawn, ready for whatever came next.